All right, today we're diving into a really intense piece of writing from the 20th century. It's a chapter from Leonard Ravenhill's famous book, Why Revival Tarries. And let me tell you, this book is, well, it's a challenge. We're going to break down his pretty stark diagnosis of the modern world and figure out why he was so convinced it had completely lost its way.
So the whole chapter really starts with this one haunting question. You can almost feel Ravenhill looking around at the world of his time, post-war, but rushing headlong into this new age of stuff. And he's just asking, why isn't anyone stirred up? It's like he's trying to solve a mystery. What's behind this deep spiritual sleep, this apathy that he's seeing all around him?
And Ravenhill, he does not beat around the bush. I mean, the very first sentence is an absolute bombshell, totally designed to shock you. He's not saying America and Britain are on the verge of falling. Nope. He's saying they've already fallen. So the big question is, what in the world does he mean by that?
Okay, so let's dig into that. To really get what he's saying, you have to understand this whole concept of an already fallen nation. For him, this has absolutely nothing to do with the economy or the military or anything like that. The collapse he's pointing to, it's all moral, it's spiritual.
He even has a name for this condition, moral anarchy. But here's his unique twist on it. This isn't chaos that's being forced on people from the outside. He's arguing that it's actually a prison that people have built for themselves. The chains, he says, are self-forged and self-chosen. That's a pretty powerful idea, right?
And to really paint a picture, he uses this incredible metaphor. He calls it a tidal wave. I mean, you can just imagine it, can't you? This unstoppable force of decay that's just washed over everything. The language is so dramatic, and that's on purpose. He's basically trying to sound a 5-alarm fire bell about a crisis he thinks is not coming, but is already here.
So, if that's the diagnosis, a fallen nation, then what are the symptoms? Well, Ravenhill points to a few very specific things in society that he thinks prove his point.
Okay, so here's what he's seeing. First, a culture that's just obsessed with pleasure. He calls it a mad merry-go-round of sensuality. He sees people willing to trade forever for just one crowded hour of glorious life. And this leads him to coin this really sharp phrase, moral imbeciles. What he means is people who are grown-ups on the outside, but spiritually and morally, they've just never grown up.
And where does this lifestyle lead? Well, according to Ravenhill, it leads right here. He uses this quote from the poet Lord Byron to really nail the feeling. It's this deep spiritual burnout, where you're left with nothing inside but ashes and this feeling of, what was it all for?
All right, so Ravenhill doesn't just list off the symptoms. He actually points a finger at what he thinks is the cause. He argues there's been this huge cultural shift, and he has a very specific target in mind for the worldview he believes is leading everyone down the wrong path.
And this is really the core of his argument in this section. He talks about a new magnetism. People are just pulled in by the power and what feels like the certainty of science. But when it comes to religion, they're mystified. They find it confusing, maybe even irrelevant. For Ravenhill, this is the central battle for the hearts and minds of people. And in his view, faith is losing. Badly.
And to really drive his point home, Ravenhill brings up a truly shocking example from his time. He points to the medical procedure of lobotomy. He sees it as the ultimate symbol of what he calls science's inhuman potential when it's totally cut off from any kind of moral compass.
And the book is incredibly graphic in its description. It's a step-by-step account. The patient is knocked unconscious, then instruments are literally inserted through the eye sockets and hammered into the brain to sever the prefrontal lobes. Ravenhill's conclusion is blunt. He says the procedure creates a zombie, a person who has been stripped of the very thing that makes them human.
And you might think, okay, that must have been super rare. But it wasn't. Ravenhill cites a news source from his time saying that 100,000 people in the U.S. alone had been lobotomized. Just think about that number. For him, the sheer scale of this was horrifying. It was proof of what can happen when science, under the banner of progress, loses its humanity.
So to show this clash of ideas, Ravenhill brings up another perspective. He points to the optimistic humanism of philosophers like Bertrand Russell. He basically presents Russell's philosophy as the competing gospel of the modern world. This message that says humanity can save itself. All we need is reason and inner peace, no God required.
And this right here is the fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got Russell's vision. We can save ourselves through logic and happiness. And on the other side, you have Ravenhill's take. He calls Russell a false prophet who's selling a dangerous, deceptive kind of hope because, from Ravenhill's perspective, it totally ignores what he sees as the core human problem, the need for spiritual redemption.
Okay, so after all of that, this pretty bleak diagnosis of society, what's the solution? What's Ravenhill's answer? Well, it's not a new law or a social program. For him, the one and only answer is something he calls revival. So let's take a look at what that path actually looks like.
Now, this is absolutely key to his whole argument. Revival, for him, doesn't start by trying to fix the world out there. It's an intense, personal, and even group return to God that has to begin inside the church. He basically argues that the religious community has to get its own house in order first before it can have any hope of making a difference in the culture. For him, all true healing has to start from the inside out.
And to show what this journey looks like, Ravenhill tells this amazing story about the famous Harvard professor William James. Here's this brilliant man, right? A genius. But he's suffering from this crushing depression and insomnia that none of the best doctors in Europe can fix. He comes back to America, basically suicidal. And at his absolute rock bottom, he reluctantly agrees to meet a simple, uneducated man of faith just to pray.
And this is the climax of the story, in William James's own words. He talks about feeling this tangible, physical thing, a mysterious energy tingling through his body, followed by this incredible sense of peace. And he just knew he was healed. You could see why Ravenhill uses this story, right? It's the perfect example for his point. A brilliant mind tries every single worldly solution and comes up empty, only to find healing through a simple act of faith.
And the chapter wraps up with this final, really challenging quote from another preacher, Joseph Parker, that Ravenhill uses to just hammer his entire argument home. The message is crystal clear. Trying to preach repentance is not a game. It's serious business, with the highest stakes imaginable. It really leaves you with this provocative thought, doesn't it? What does it actually mean to be committed enough to call a fallen world to change?